On May 13, 2026, the Air Force One aircraft landed in Beijing, and the first thing Donald Trump saw through the airplane window was a long line of Chinese officials standing waiting on the runway, a full state ceremony, a long red carpet, the entire machinery symbolizing the power of a 5,000-year civilization mobilized just to welcome one person. That person had just imposed 145% tariffs on Chinese goods, attacked Iran with 3 types of weapons never before used in combat, and pushed global oil prices to levels that Beijing had to endure every day. And China still rolled out the red carpet, even doing exactly what Trump requested, staging what he called the largest scale performance in Chinese history. Western media called Trump naive in front of Xi Jinping. Commentators said he was being taken advantage of, but they were looking at the wrong thing, because there was one person in that meeting room that day who looked straight into Xi Jinping's eyes and said things no previous U.S. president had dared to say before, and Xi did not smile. What was happening in Beijing was not ordinary diplomacy. It was a weapon, described by Machiavelli 500 years ago, practiced by Kissinger in 1972, and now being deployed by Trump at this moment with a precision that most of the world has not yet realized. To understand what really happened inside the meeting room at the Great Hall of the People on May 14, you need to start from a detail that most newspapers reporting on this visit completely overlooked. Before Air Force One took off, Trump had told the Chinese side that he wanted them to stage the largest scale performance in Chinese history. And China did exactly that. From the long line of officials on the runway to the state welcome at the Great Hall, from the state banquet to the visit to the Temple of Heaven, arranged like a scene in an epic film. The first and most important question is not what Trump said to Xi, but why Xi agreed to do all of that at the request of the person imposing 145% tariffs on his country's goods. The answer to that question will explain everything that happened next. In the meeting room full of Chinese officials, Trump sat down and opened with words that Western media later described as controversial, unprincipled, even embarrassing. He said this was the greatest relationship between 2 presidents in the history of the 2 countries. He said Xi Jinping was a great leader, and he said the sentence I want you to pay special attention to. Many people don't like me saying this, but I still say it because it's the truth. After more than 2 hours of talks, the 2 leaders walked together through the grounds of the Temple of Heaven, an architecture from the 15th century, and when asked for his impressions, Trump replied, "Fantastic. China is very beautiful, truly amazing." The press reported those sentences as if they were evidence of naivety. But to understand why they were wrong, you need to know the real context of this visit. The trip was originally planned for April, but had to be postponed because of the Iran war. Iran had closed the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation for U.S. attacks, disrupting one of the world's most important energy shipping routes, sharply driving up oil prices, and creating enormous economic pressure on the United States itself. Trump needed China, Iran's largest oil customer, to pressure Tehran to reopen that strait. This is the context in which all of Trump's praises must be read. Analysts assess that the current easing between the 2 countries is mainly tactical, while strategic competition continues to increase on all fronts, from economy to military to technology. So if both sides know that, why did Trump still praise, and why did Xi still listen? The answer starts from a detail about Donald Trump's childhood that few people notice. Trump grew up attending the church of Reverend Norman Vincent Peale, author of the book The Power of Positive Thinking. The central philosophy of that book is that language does not just describe reality but also creates reality, that saying positive things strongly and often enough will make them become true. Trump did not praise Xi out of politeness. He praised because he believes language is a constructive tool, and he used that tool with a precision you will understand more clearly when I explain the mechanism below. What Trump is doing has a name in negotiation theory, and it is not weakness, it is controlled flattery, a technique that works based on a fundamental principle about human nature that Machiavelli wrote in 1513. The one who wants to deceive will always find someone who wants to be deceived. That sentence is not a moral criticism, it is a cold observation about how humans actually operate, that we are not led by reason but by vanity, pride, the need for recognition, and the fear of losing face. Trump understands that instinctively, and the sentence, "Many people don't like me saying this, but I still say it," is the most accurate proof. That sense is not just praise for Xi. It implicitly informs Xi that Trump is sacrificing his own political standing at home, confronting his own voters, just to show respect for him. In East Asian culture, where face is not a fleeting emotion but real power currency, that gesture has value that is almost unquantifiable. Dale Carnegie, who systematized this art into a book in 1936, wrote that people protect their dignity even more strongly than they protect truth, that when you attack someone's truth, they may concede, but when you attack their dignity, they will fight to the end. Conversely, when you give someone enough face to step towards you, they do not just step, they also thank you for giving them the opportunity to do so. To understand how this mechanism works at the personal level, before applying it to geopolitics, remember a small story that happened when Trump was seeing guests out of the White House. Co-host Ricky joked with Trump in front of everyone, "Don't worry, he'll say good things about you tomorrow." Trump turned around, not smiling, and said bluntly, "Don't worry, if not, I'll say he's a big loser." That is exactly the operating mechanism. Flattery and deterrence are not two opposing strategies, but two sides of the same coin. And Trump switches from one side to the other so quickly that the other party often doesn't realize which side they are on. Expert Alan Carlson from Cornell University, one of the leading scholars on Chinese foreign policy, assessed that the summit itself was already a victory for China in terms of enhancing its reputation as a superpower and its potential to become a mediator in the Middle East. Mr. Carlson said that as a neutral observation. But if you understand Trump, you will realize this is exactly what Trump wanted Xi to feel, that this meeting was a victory for China, that Xi was in a position of strength, that this was a historic moment for him personally. Because a person who feels they are winning is much more willing to make concessions than someone who feels they are losing. And the result came right after, exactly as could be predicted if you understand the formula. Xi Jinping declared he was ready to provide whatever Trump needed to end the Iran war. The two leaders exchanged views on the situation in the Middle East, Ukraine, and the Korean Peninsula for more than 2 hours, longer than the meeting in Busan last October. This was not goodwill. This was the predictable result when a leader is treated correctly according to their ego. And the real question now is not whether China wants to help the US or not, but for the first time in modern history, what role China will play in a Middle East conflict and how that will change the global geopolitical map. But flattery is only half the story. And the other half is what makes this entire strategy work, because if you just praise without anything behind that praise, you are not a negotiator, you are just a flatterer. To understand the other half, you need to go back to a dinner that took place a few years before this Beijing visit. A dinner where Trump and Xi Jinping sat together in a perfect diplomatic atmosphere. Food was served. The two delegations sat on either side. Everything proceeded according to the protocol that professional diplomats spend their careers arranging. Then Trump apologized, stood up, and left the table. He went upstairs, stepped into a secure room that the Americans call the skiff, a room completely shielded from any eavesdropping devices where the most classified decisions are made. And there, Trump sat down and watched live on screen the death of General Qasem Soleimani, commander of Iran's Quds Force, one of the most powerful figures in the Middle East for 2 decades. After watching, he stood up, went down, sat back at the dinner table, and said to Xi Jinping, "Sorry for leaving. I just had to take care of General Soleimani." Xi Jinping looked at Trump, said nothing. And in that same meeting, at another moment when the two sides were discussing a tense issue that China wanted to push, Trump looked straight into Xi's eyes and said, "You don't want to do that because I can wipe out Beijing." Xi smiled, the kind of smile East Asian leaders use when they don't yet know how to respond. Looked back at Trump, and Trump didn't smile, didn't look away, just looked straight, silent, waiting. Xi understood the message. Now stop and think about what just happened in that same meeting, because this is the point that most analysts miss. In the same meeting, Trump had just said, "You are the great leader I respect the most," and also said, "I can wipe out your capital." Those two messages do not contradict each other. They are two sides of the same strategy, and their simultaneous existence does not cancel each other out, but multiplies their effectiveness. And the proof that this effectiveness is still working to this day is that on the eve of the Beijing summit in May 2026, US, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi agreed that no country or organization would be allowed to impose fees on traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, a strategic concession by China to the US, position without any war, without any UN resolution, and without any round of negotiations that could achieve it. Only the memory of a dinner and an unaverted gaze. To understand why this dual structure works, you need to understand that it solves two psychological problems that any negotiator must face at the same time. The first problem, how to get the other side to concede without feeling subdued in front of their own people. The second problem, how to make the other side understand that not conceding has a specific and possible price. Flattery solves the first problem. It creates an escape space, an honorable way out for the other side to step toward you without losing face in front of their public. Deterrence solves the second problem. It establishes a psychological threshold, a clear boundary about what will happen if that escape is not used. What Trump does is not use one, then the other in sequence. He uses both at the same time in the same meeting, sometimes in the same conversation. And that combination creates a very special psychological state in the other party. They feel respected enough to cooperate and afraid enough not to refuse. The detail of Trump watching Soleimani live on screen was not random. It was a calculated performance with an extremely specific message. We just carried out one of the most complex assassinations in modern military history. We did it while having dinner with you. We were not distracted at all. And I sit here watching it like an evening news broadcast, then return to the table without changing my expression. That message did not need to be put into words. It spoke for itself, and it spoke more clearly than any threat could. The nuclear threat about Beijing works on the same logic, but at a different level. It is not a threat in the ordinary sense, but the establishment of a psychological threshold, a statement about the scope of what could happen so the other side knows what kind of limited space they are negotiating in. Benjamin Franklin, known to many as a diplomat, scientist, and founder, few know he was also one of the greatest negotiation masters in American history, discovered a principle that psychologists later called the Franklin effect. When you ask your enemy for a small favor, you do not lower yourself, but you send them the signal that you trust their ability and judgment enough to ask, and the entire relationship changes in a direction that no direct confrontation could create. Trump did not just ask Xi, he also showed Xi that he trusted him enough to be honest about Soleimani right at the dinner table, to speak bluntly about nuclear weapons without going through diplomatic language, to treat him as a real peer rather than a partner carefully managed through official channels. That is the Franklin effect at the geopolitical level, and its effect can be measured by what China is doing right now. Machiavelli, in The Prince written in 1513, posed the question that every leader must answer: is it better to be loved or to be feared? His answer was that the ideal is both, but he also warned that this is extremely difficult to achieve because love and fear often cancel each other out when used by the same person in the same relationship. Trump resolves that paradox by not letting the two clash directly. Flattery is used at the public, symbolic, emotional level, while deterrence is used at the private, substantive, strategic level, and those two levels are never mixed in front of the public. The result of that structure is clearly visible right now. China is supporting Pakistan's mediating role in promoting US-Iran dialogue and supporting the extension of the ceasefire, not because Beijing suddenly fell in love with peace in the Middle East, but because Xi Jinping understands very clearly the price of not doing so. The US and Iran had sat negotiating for 21 hours in Islamabad without reaching consensus on the Strait of Hormuz and the nuclear program. The two sides were still too far apart on interests to find an exit themselves. The question now is not whether there is a solution, but whether Iran has received a similar message to what Xi received at that dinner table, and if so, who that message will come from. To answer that question, you need to understand why this formula works not just with Xi Jinping, but with anyone at any scale in any context. What makes this formula frightening is not that it is complex, but that it has been proven effective continuously for more than half a century, through many different leaders, many different geopolitical contexts, and the measurable results in each application are large enough to change history. In 1972, Henry Kissinger stepped off the plane in Beijing to meet Mao Zedong, the man directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of 60 to 90 million Chinese people through political campaigns and man-made famine. And Kissinger stood before him, in front of the lenses of the whole world, and called Mao a great philosopher, a man of profound historical vision, discipline and understanding of history in a rare way. American public opinion was outraged. Western media was shocked. Many called it a national disgrace. None of those outraged understood what was really happening, because the result of that meeting did not appear immediately, but took 7 years to fully materialize. And when it did, it was one of the greatest geopolitical shifts of the 20th century. China split from the Soviet Union, the global communist alliance fractured, and the Cold War balance of power tilted decisively toward the US. A compliment to a dictator who killed 90 million people was exchanged for a global power shift. Kissinger did not praise Mao because he liked Mao. He praised because he understood something that most professional diplomats do not. Mao did not need to be persuaded by logic. He needed to be recognized as a thinker of stature, a great historical figure, not just the military leader of a poor country that had just gone through a revolution. Kissinger gave him that, and in return received something that no economic or military pressure could buy. Then came Trump and Kim Jong-un, and the formula was repeated with such bluntness that many did not recognize it as the formula. Trump called Kim a little fat loser, phrases that global media quoted as evidence of unprofessionalism. Then Trump flew to Singapore, sat down across from Kim Jong-un and said, "I love this guy. He's terrific, strong, smart." And what happened next was something no U.S. administration in 70 years of conflict with North Korea had achieved. For the first time in history, a sitting U.S. president sat down at the negotiating table with the North Korean leader. And throughout that period, North Korea suspended missile tests. That is a measurable fact, not an interpretation. Kim Jong-un was a leader completely isolated from the international community, despised and shunned by the whole world. When Trump treated him like an equal partner, not because Trump respected him, but because it was the cheapest price to open negotiation space, Kim had reason to respond, because no one sits at the negotiating table when they are being humiliated in front of the world. Machiavelli wrote this 500 years ago. Public loss of face turns a negotiation about interests into a matter of survival and ego, and when that happens, no logic, no economic pressure, no military threat can replace the only thing the other wants, to be treated like a human being with dignity. That formula has been consistent across 3 generations: Kissinger with Mao in 1972, Trump with Kim in 2018, Trump with Xi in 2025 and 2026, and each time applied, the results were greater than what outside observers predicted, because they continued to evaluate using the language of reason, while what was being operated was the language of ego. But this round ends with a detail I want you to pay attention to, because it shows the formula does not just run in one direction. During the Beijing visit in May 2026, after all the praises, after the state banquet, after the photo session at the Temple of Heaven, Xi Jinping bluntly warned that if the Taiwan issue is not handled well, conflict could occur and push U.S.-China relations into a very dangerous situation. Flattery done, deterrence follows. Xi is using Trump's own formula in reverse, and Trump knows it, and both know the other knows. That is why the meeting lasted more than 2 hours. Because when 2 people understand the language being used, the conversation becomes very different from ordinary diplomacy. And the question now, as China is playing a mediating role in Iran, as U.S.-Iran negotiations are still deadlocked after 21 hours in Islamabad, is whether this formula will be applied again, and if so, who in Tehran will be the next to receive praise from Donald Trump. So zoom out and look at the entire picture, because when you place those 3 rounds next to each other, what emerges is not a collection of random events, but a consistent negotiation doctrine being systematically deployed on a global scale. 3 rounds, 3 opponents different in culture and political system and strategic interests, but the same formula. Give the opponent enough face so they can step toward you without losing face in front of their own people, and at the same time, make them understand clearly enough the price of not stepping. Machiavelli systematized this principle in 1513. Kissinger practiced it in 1972 and exchanged it for the greatest geopolitical shift of the 20th century. Carnegie named it in a book that sold tens of millions of copies. Franklin proved it works even with mortal enemies. And Trump applies it instinctively, not according to diplomacy textbooks, not according to the advice of professional advisors, from the level of a television host apologizing on air to the level of a head of state sitting at the dinner table and receiving news of the death of General Soleimani. What is happening in Beijing is not Trump being naive in front of Xi Jinping. What is happening is a negotiator who understands ego operating on an opponent who also understands ego. And both are using the same language while most of the world is reading the wrong translation. Look at Iran right now to see it more clearly. Tehran is in a negotiation deadlock with Washington, determined to delay any concessions, demanding concessions from the U.S. Side first, putting forward 14-point proposals that Trump bluntly called garbage. This is exactly the behavior of a side that has not been treated correctly with their ego, a side negotiating from a position of humiliation rather than from a position of interests. And when that happens, according to Machiavelli, no pressure is strong enough to create an agreement, because the negotiation has stopped being about interests and become about survival and dignity. The question now is what will change that equation, and the answer may lie in what is happening right now in Beijing. China is emerging as a potential peace mediator in the Middle East, supporting Pakistan's role in U.S.-Iran negotiations, pressuring Tehran through the economic leverage that only Beijing has because China is Iran's largest oil customer. If that really happens, if China becomes the bridge for Iran and the US to find an exit, this will be the first time in modern history that an Asian superpower meaningfully intervenes in a Middle East conflict and changes its outcome. The global geopolitical map will need to be redrawn, not because of a new type of weapon, not because of a new military alliance, but because of a dinner, an unaverted gaze, and a few words of praise spoken at the right time to the right person. That is what is really happening in Beijing, and now you understand why. Xi Jinping and Donald Trump have just concluded more than 2 hours of talks at the Great Hall of the People, a meeting longer than the one in Busan in October 2025, longer than any bilateral exchange between these two leaders in many years. And when the meeting ended, Xi declared he was ready to provide whatever Trump needed to end the Iran war. If you have watched this far, you know that is not surprising news. It is the precisely predictable result when you understand the formula. The question now is what the next step will be. Who will be the next to receive praise from Trump, and what the world will look like when all those pieces fall into their right places. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this story is not over, and the next part will be more important than everything you just watched. If analyses like this are what you are looking for, not surface news but the real logic behind what is happening in the world, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. See you in the next video.